I'm 0xhank. I am a game developer at Primodium.
Arb, I'm a co-founder of Moving Castles.
And today we're going to be discussing using large language models as a myth-making mechanism. So back in May, Arthur, myself, and our friend Smallbrain were all at this conference called Zuzulu, and it was a very memorable experience. And we were just kind of working together on a few hackathons, and then suddenly we just started hearing all this content coming from all directions about network states, where like rich people buy some desert island and all move there. And we didn't really know what to make about this. All we knew was that this sounded like a really sick idea for a video game. And so we were like, let's do it. And so we did it for a hackathon that week. Arthur and I in particular were interested in thinking about games as narrative engines. So how we define a narrative engine is it's a system that produces drama. And by drama, we mean tension, funny moments, and conflict that just arises from some rule set. And so we decided to use a really simple and basic set of rules that would kind of allow us to experiment. And so here's how the game works. I'm sure some of you have played it already. You spawn in on this 2D grid, and your capital increases its population every block. And then you can just move around the 2D grid, exploring the space. And eventually, you're going to end up running into other players who have also spawned in this same environment. And that's it. That's the whole engine that we developed. And you can see that there's not really enough here to generate really interesting and dynamic stories. It's a really simple set of rules. And so then we wanted to start exploring how we can generate myths out of this drama that would be occurring in our game. And so that's where the myth-making mechanism comes in. And how we define a myth-making mechanism is it's a system for documenting the drama generated by our narrative engine to create really memorable stories and experiences for users, specifically for us, the players of our game network states. And we asked ourselves, we really want to kind of emphasize this idea of like network states, like 21st century like societies with all these kind of interesting and weird ideals and governance models. How can we get the game to generate that stuff automatically for us? And as this was May of 2023, we were like, large language models, this is like a 2-day hackathon. All we do is we take all of the on-chain data that we've created, we give it a little bit of context, and we throw it in a large language model, and it'll give us a really robust and interesting story for free just by hitting an API endpoint.
This was wrong. What it gave us was very similar outputs all the time. So for example, this is just one example of hundreds of these problems. We said, be inspired by the naming of the leaders of the states by Silicon Valley founders. So what it did is it called them all Elon. And we had many problems like this. And we were like, okay, this clearly doesn't work. Maybe there was GPT was not the solution to creating great narratives from on-chain states. But we didn't give up. And, so at the same time, funnily enough, we weren't the only ones coming to this conclusion. There was this research paper, for example, which clearly, as we found, articulates vanilla, flat, generic, unmotivated, harsh critic, I would say. Here, formulaic, generalized style. And we basically, the problem we had is we just created very similar outputs all the time. On first look, kind of cool. But then when you started playing it, it was just the same sentence over and over again with slight variations. So we thought, okay, who does this well? Who is actually creating interesting narratives out of games? And there are games like this, Dwarf Fortress, for example, and they use something called procedural narrative generation. They don't use LLMs, funnily enough. And we isolated 3 approaches from these games. One is developing character traits and motivations. 2 is doing event simulations. And 3 is doing style and writing variations. So we thought, okay, let's implement that. And our insight was we can actually use procedural narrative techniques to craft the GPT prompts themselves. So you have a game state, you interpret that game state, craft a prompt using procedural narrative creation, and then you give that to GPT and you get some nice outcomes. So practically, we started with each state has a randomized funding type, ideology, technology, and government structure. And here we have some nice outputs. We start getting some variation. We have a state based on theocratic totalitarianism.
Justice is enemy's handmaid, and the mountain shadow casts long lines of moral absolutism.
We have one on American dynamism.
Unshackled from old geopolitics. It's a nucleus for the brave, the odd courting destiny with a silicon-fused heart.
Beautiful, Hank. Thank you. We also realized that to break the kind of repeating narrative and sentence structure, we had to use really cheap tricks. This is maybe the cheapest trick of them all. We have 2 lists, one called tricks and one called focuses, that it randomizes from, and it tells it to focus on different things. And through that, we get a lot of variation. So here is like, what is the ideology that fueled the state's formation? Or begin with a bold statement about the foundational moment. And then you get all these variations in outcomes just by using a simple trick like this. Funnily enough, GPT, not really good at generating random numbers. Okay, and then the last and maybe most complex one is that we created a state motivation model for each state. So you start kind of in the middle, and then based on your play style, you move within this motivational model, and it changes your tone of voice completely. So expansionist is based on if you attack other players. Isolated is if you don't. Confident is your proportional scale in comparison to other players. And insecurity, of course, if you're small to other players. And then we get really weird outcomes here. Blood for the blood god, genes for the genome throne. This is some kind of genome network state. Also, we have low confidence, and low expansionism is a state driven by envy. So I think that like with these tricks, can you go to the next slide? We've kind of successfully shown that by combining procedural narrative creation and LLMs, we can create a context-aware tone. We can add high variation and novelty. And we actually have low deviation from core narrative, which we would get if we would only pull up the temperature on the GPT, which is another way of creating variation. You're next.
Next steps. There's a ton more work to explore here. We kind of only really scratched the surface with the work that we've already done. What I think kind of the gold standard is being able to have a single narrative that all the different prompts are pulling from without losing that same thread of history. So we have, for example, one battle, and even if it's told from 2 different perspectives, the facts of the battle remain the same. We want to give players the power to kind of shape the prompts as well. Instead of just feeding random numbers, players can choose if they want to have a state which is like a theocracy or is a democracy or whatever they so desire. And then the last one is just optimizing the prompts. The prompts are not optimized at all. We're using a lot of tokens, which just makes the outputs more expensive. And we want to really figure out how we can kind of pull out and optimize those tricks so that we can have really high quality outputs.
I also think that like looking at other models than GPT, open source models would be really interesting. We kind of like started with this. It seems like there's a lot of possibilities in like training custom models as well. Something that would be really cool to do after this.
And we'll leave you with this post-assembly question that everybody should have upvoted already. How can we develop narratives in our autonomous worlds that are based on player actions? We've seen in traditional games, usually there is a preset narrative that you follow, and that heavily shapes the course of your experience. How can we really focus on optimizing the player actions to drive the narrative and the drama and the myths that end up being created by our games?
We leave you with a beautiful demo. So you can all use your phones right now and scan this QR code. and you can generate your own state by choosing your ideology, your confidence, your state type. It's a bit laggy because every time you move a slider, it generates the whole prompt. So that's an explainer why it's a bit slow, but it's because it's doing so much work. Have fun.